So the USA and Russia are negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine, and the Europeans, as well as the US neocon establishment, are still freaking out over it. I've done already a couple of episodes on this with different guests, but let me just show you how desperate these people are at the moment, and by way of the New York Times, just also illustrate in what kind of fantasy world they are living, or what kind of fantasy world they are trying to make you believe is reality. After that, I will show you what real analysis looks like, and we will read one or two texts on what's actually going on. But let's start with the New York Times. So I'll switch my screen so that you can see what's going on here. Um, Take already this rubric that the New York Times has, right? This headline of everything that the New York Times gathers together as articles on the Russia-Ukraine war. The subtitle reads that a bitter and bloody war in Ukraine has devastated the country, further isolated Russia from the West, and fueled economic insecurity around the world. This is already interesting that they here have this urge to say that Russia is isolated, right? They add that it's isolated from the West, which is certainly true. But the idea that Russia is isolated, this is still something, even after 3 years, that the New York Times is trying to massage into the brains of its readers, right? Russia is isolated, while it has one fantastic trade relationship with China, fantastic trade relationship with India. It is very well connected around the globe, with the exception of the Europeans and the North Americans. But with everybody else, they are trading. But here, still the idea, the framing of the isolated Russia is, even after 3 years, super important to the New York Times. And of course, that this creates economic insecurity around the world is also one of these issues that I must say, like, well, this is true for Europe. And maybe it's true to some extent for North America, although there I don't believe it's true to the same extent. But the New York Times again equates this, especially Europe, with the world. I mean, what are you talking about? Again, the oil got much cheaper for India to buy, and the Indians and the Chinese, they get more economic security at the moment. How come that the New York Times still equates Europe with the world? But well, that's what it is. Just let's look at this one article down here, which is also a masterpiece, not a masterpiece in spinning. That's the wrong word. It's at this point, it's so bad. It's so bad propaganda that it screams propaganda from every page. The article is entitled "Trump Flips the Script on the Ukraine War, Blaming Zelensky, Not Putin." Subtitle: As he seeks to negotiate a peace deal with Moscow, President Trump is rewriting the history of Russia's invasion of its neighbor. In this article, the person who wrote this, that's this man here, Peter Baker, complains the entire time about Donald Trump somehow telling an alternative history of the war and giving alternative facts and being so blatantly untrue and being a blatant liar. And now I want to go with you through a couple of these arguments. I cannot show you the entire article because it's behind a paywall, but I can show you extracts and discuss them. So, and just who is Peter Baker? He's the chief White House correspondent and the former Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times. This is quite fantastic. This person has been in Moscow and should have access to information, but obviously decides, or his editors decided, that his article will be spun in the way that the New York Times thinks reality should be, not what it is. Let's start. The article starts with when Russian forces crashed over the borders into Ukraine in 2022, determined to wipe it off the map as an independent state, the United States rushed to the aid of the beleaguered nation and cast its president Volodymyr Zelensky as a hero of resistance. This is the opening statement. No mention, nothing of the history of this war. No mention whatsoever, nothing of all the time between at least 2014 until 2022, of all the back and forth, of all the problems, and of all the warfare in the Donbass, of the shelling of the Donbass. Nothing. It establishes this world in which one bright morning on the 24th of February 2022, Putin woke up and decided to invade Ukraine out of pure evil, right? And the United States, being the shining knight on the white horse just coming to the aid of the poor victim, right? That's what this fantasy world of these people looks like, or what they want to make believe, what they keep repeating. And this is exactly what is now falling apart in front of our eyes. But still, this is in on the 19th of February 2025. This is still what these people write. This is still how they frame, how they begin the history of the Ukraine war in a current affairs article. The article then just continues the elaborating why Donald Trump is such an utter liar when he cast doubt on this, the official narrative. We must remember this is the New York Times telling us what the official narrative of the war is, how they want it to be. But Mr. Trump went on characterizing Mr. Zelensky not as a defender of democracy, but an enemy of it, Mr. Baker writes, right? And then he quotes somebody. He refuses to have elections. Oh, he quotes Mr. Trump. Mr. Baker quotes Mr. Trump saying he refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. Mr. Trump wrote, says Mr. Baker. A dictator without elections, Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. So Baker gives us what Trump says, right? In order to illustrate the outrageousness of Trump's comments. Then Baker continues in his article, while Ukraine has suspended elections during the war, Mr. Zelensky was in fact originally elected by a landslide in 2019 in a contest deemed free and fair by the international community, unlike Mr. Putin, an actual dictator who has stayed in power for a quarter century through elections widely deemed to be a farce. And Mr. Zelensky enjoys a 57% approval rating, according to a new poll, higher than Mr. Trump's. So again, no mention that Mr. Zelensky's official term ended last year in 2024, and that Mr. Zelensky, yeah, he suspended elections during the war, but no mention that by now Mr. Zelensky actually really has a problem with legitimacy, right? Whatever you think about the situation in the war. It's fantastic to me. And then, of course, quoting some new polling that conveniently finds. And I didn't bother clicking on the link to see where this polling is coming from, because at this point we know that any kind of polling data, any kind of statements by NGOs, by organizations, basically means pretty little until and unless you actually have elections. We won't know. We won't know for sure. This is why actual elections are really important, and also casting Mr. Putin as a unelected dictator, when in fact it is pretty clear that actually his approval ratings are doing pretty well. That is this other thing of the spinning, of the framing, that is just absolutely fantastic. Still they would love to believe that the Russian people are still only at the verge of rebelling against Vladimir Putin, right? And you just need to press a little bit more. That's where this narrative is going. But let's continue, because Mr. Baker also writes that Charles M. Kupperman, who served as Mr. Trump's deputy national security advisor in his first term, compared the president's actions to the British prime minister who tried to appease Adolf Hitler by agreeing to give him part of Czechoslovakia. Trump's name will be remembered in history as a surrender artist, just like Neville Chamberlain, Mr. Kupperman said in an interview. So just think for 1 second, like Baker remembers that he has this whole phone book of people who share his opinions, so he just gives one of them a call in order for that person to tell him something that he wanted to hear in the first place, and then he quotes that. And the obvious thing here is to compare Trump to Chamberlain as and deride and kind of trash talk all kinds of peace negotiations as appeasement. This is the dirtiest of dirty, stupid little tricks in order to continue warmongering, because you just claim that not continuing a war, not going to war, or not continuing a war is appeasement. That's like they really had to try very hard to drag the word peace through the mud. And appeasement, that's the mud, right? That's how you get it. So, and he found somebody, some Well, I mean, there's people who have this opinion, right? He found somebody with that opinion who told him what he wanted to hear, and he put that into his article. Well done, Mr. Baker. Congratulations on creating a narrative and the world that how you would like it to be. Baker continues. Donald Trump's disregard for Ukraine later grew into outright animosity as he became persuaded that Ukraine had intervened in the 2016 elections against him, repeating a propaganda line pushed by Russia, which actually did intervene in the elections on Mr. Trump's behalf. And now, and now, you guessed it, what's going to come next? Yes, this dude, this Baker, actually warms up again the whole Trump collusion narrative, the Russia interference narrative. It's fascinating. I mean, just look at this. Trump was driven in his first term by the intense desire to disprove any Russian collusion in the 2016 election. Mr. Kopperman recalled he wanted to demonstrate he won without any outside influence or interference, and did nod at him when it came to allegations that he won because of Russian assistance. Ukraine became one path to demonstrate he won without any such assistance. So now this dude who Baker interviewed actually tries to psychologize, to look into Trump's head and to understand why Trump now hates Ukraine, right? And he blames it on Trump being angry at Ukraine because of the 2016 election, because he got blamed um, for Russian interference. And the Baker himself, by having established in the previous sentence that actually Russia intervened in the election on Mr. Trump's behalf, right? He established this as the narrative truth that now gets explored further down. And this is insane because we had not one but two official investigations. Do you remember the Mueller report that looked into whether there was any collusion between Trump and Russia, or whether Russia somehow systematically helped Trump to win? And the Mueller report unequivocally found that there is no evidence of any Russian collusion. There's no evidence that the Russians systematically supported Trump in a way that helped him win in the 2016 elections. And then there was a second report to dig into whether there ever was a case for actually starting a investigation into this whole collusion thing, which did start actually after 2016. And the special counsel John Durham concludes that the FBI never should have launched a full Trump-Russia probe. There is not one but two such reports that came out, and even mainstream media had to report about. I mean, this is CNN, this is NPR. This was so big that even they couldn't get around reporting the actual results of these investigations, and they made it crystal clear that the whole Steele dossier was actually linked to the campaign of Hillary Clinton and was basically a hoax. Just this is the Democrats since 2016 not being able to understand that they really, truly, honestly lost in a campaign against Donald Trump, and that it wasn't Russia that gave Donald Trump the presidency. They're still not over it. It's 2025, and they're still not over it. They are still peddling this lie and this narrative that Donald Trump only won because of Russian interference, and that now, since this was alleged, now Trump is kind of cracking down on Ukraine and he has scores to settle, right? This is just, at this point, very sick. It's a sick understanding of the world, of how these people want reality to be. And then they claim that this sick version of reality is what Donald Trump is now lying about. So this is fantastic to me because it's getting so utterly, completely clear that it's really hard to still take anything serious that this piece of garbage paper here is writing. That's apparently the paper of record of the United States. Sorry to say that. So that leaves us with the question where we should get proper information from if we want to read something about what's actually going on. And here the best recommendation I have for everybody is to do what a lot of us academics do, which is we get ourselves onto different mailing lists of people who we trust, who we know have a good understanding of things that are happening. So you just need to look around. Let me share something with you. One of the lists that I'm on is by colleagues who then send over actual articles that are of value. And most of these articles, interestingly, are not behind paywalls, which is why I can, for instance, read this article here to you. This one here is in the National Interest, fantastic magazine, previously headed by Katrina van den Heuvel, and who has been doing some very good reporting. I mean, you can have different opinions on the national interest, but some of these pieces are really great. And if you are on a mailing list of people who actually care about this, they will send around some of these best articles. So this one here I want to read to you is by a man called Matthew Blackburn. That's him here, who's a senior researcher at the research group on Russia, Asia, and international trade at the NUPI. Um, it's a think tank, and he's also affiliated to a university in Europe. I forgot which one, but he is doing a very good job at looking at the realities on the ground, and he wrote about this in this article here in the National Interest. The National Interest. Europe's reality check, because this is what's currently happening. The Europeans and also these neocons, New York Times people are being slapped in the face by reality that comes cracking down. Let me read you this one. As Donald Trump negotiates with Russia, Europe needs statesmanship and strategic thinking rather than knee-jerk emotive rhetoric and moral panic. Europe's weakness has never been so openly on display. President Donald Trump has shattered the existing framework of Western support for Ukraine. America has officially abandoned a hugely costly and failed 19-year quest to expand NATO into Ukraine. The commitment to ensuring Kiev regains its pre-2014 territory is now cancelled. The United States will neither send troops to Ukraine nor extend Article 5 to any Western peacekeepers deployed there. Europe is now expected to foot the bill of defending and rebuilding Ukraine, while America seeks to recoup some of the 175 billion US dollars it has spent on the war with a deal granting it ownership of Ukrainian rare earth minerals. According to Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, Europe won't even have a decisive say in the deal America makes to end the war. At an emergency summit in Paris called straight after the traumatic Munich Security Conference, Europe's leaders could not agree among themselves on any new common position. The Europe's pro-Ukraine commentariat, this is not for Europe's pro-Ukrainian commentariat, this is nothing short of a nightmare. They, as well as most European leaders, have spent 3 years ignoring or outright denying every sign that the West is unable to defeat Russia in Ukraine. At every juncture, they wanted to spin the roulette wheel of escalation just one more time to weaken Russia. And let me just comment here personally. This is exactly what happened. I mean, this is what was so unbelievable to many of us, that the Europeans would be willing to escalate so much when they were the ones who had the most to lose from this conflict getting even worse. But let me get back to the article. They systematically ignored the evidence of Ukraine's military decline and still call for yet more support. Their support for Ukraine was once encapsulated by the phrase, "We stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes." In 2024, it shifted to, "Ukraine is on an irreversible pathway to NATO and we must put them in the strongest possible negotiating position." Now, in 2025, there is a third version. "No negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine, and peace through strength." What does this slogan entail? Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski characterized the conflict as a classic colonial war that could continue for another 10 years. And again, parentheses, and from my end, Sikorski is of course the Polish guy, the foreign minister, and who at the time was in the EU Parliament or in the Polish Parliament and wrote "Thank you USA" when the pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline, was blown up. So that's this Sikorski. And it's absolutely true. He belongs to this group of fanatics in Europe who want to continue this as long as possible. Let me get back to the article. Europe's hardliners are quite prepared to watch Ukraine turn into a Syria-style failed state as long as Russia does not win. The moral concern to stop Putin does not, however, extend to the Ukrainian people themselves, who are to be sacrificed for the greater good of weakening and containing Russia. The hardliners are proposing a truly nightmare scenario. Europe prolongs a war it cannot win until Ukraine's collapse opens a Pandora's box, just as America's walk back its security commitments. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and Volodymyr Zelensky call for a rapid burst of defense spending, implying that Europe's GDP, 10 times higher than Russia's, can be rapidly converted into an effective and deployable military force. This ignores the basic fact on the ground. The balance of power has swung in Russia's favor. Ukraine is running out of men. Lithuania's defense minister admits the Russian army is 3 times bigger than it was in February 2022. Zelensky reports the Russian army is about to expand another 15,000 people. Meanwhile, Europe cannot ramp up defense production in time to save the situation. Russia is outproducing them. And do you see how beautifully this person also includes links in order to illustrate all of these claims in order to say, like, look, this is actually based on research. This is actually based on what you can find. Also can find out freely actually on the internet. So it's not as if that this information is super well hidden. We don't know how many people exactly Ukraine lost or Russia lost, because that's guarded as a secret. But a lot of the rest of what's happening in Ukraine is actually accessible to people who just have a rudimentary understanding of how to use the internet in order to get to information. Back to the article. Independent reports have established the woeful state of Europe's leading militaries, deficient not only in trained soldiers but also in weapons and equipment, much of which has already been donated to Ukraine. Building a European army without US support or leadership is an unprecedented challenge that will take a decade. The fundamental disagreement among European leaders on deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine points to a deeper problem. Europe can talk the talk, but cannot walk the walk without muscle or a unified plan. Europe cannot take Russia on now. A deal is necessary. The West has played its hand, from weapons deliveries to sanctions and diplomacy to isolate Russia. There is strong evidence that Russia's economic problems in 2025 will not be serious enough to weaken its war effort. Yet many influential voices in Europe are stuck repeating the same old tropes for why the war must continue. The first trope is on Russian casualties, outlandishly claimed to be rising toward 1 million, which is used as an argument for continuing the war on the grounds that Ukraine can still fight. Meanwhile, silence reigns on the subject of Ukrainian losses. The hardliners do not want to admit the depth of Ukraine's manpower problem. If they fail in their drive to mobilize 18 to 20-year-old men, they will not be able to hold the front lines. Given the news of US-Russia diplomacy, can we expect huge numbers of young people to sign up to die in a war that may soon be over? The second trope is that Russia cannot be trusted under any circumstance. Appeasement of Russia will embolden its imperial expansion. There is clear contradiction between the claim of Russian losses and the assumption of a continuous Russian expansion. If Russia is already so weak, how could it contemplate invading a NATO country? Yet we are told Russia is simultaneously on the way of 1917-style regime collapse and that it is ready to roll through Europe as the latest incarnation of Nazi Germany. And again, I need to just make a comment here, because this is so correct and this has happened so many times in this goddamn war, that we are simultaneously told two stories that contradict each other from the same people. These contradictions are actually baked into the narrative because they must be believed. This is this psychological mechanism, and I don't think these people are doing this on purpose. But this is how the psychology of war psychosis and crisis psychosis works, that people who are caught by the psychosis, they lose the ability to recognize that two of their beliefs are actually ultimately at odds with each other. but they claim them anyhow. And if anyone dares to attack one or the other or point this out, then that person will immediately be outcast from the group of good people, of rational beings. Because if you forced people to recognize this cognitive dissonance, well, they would shatter, right? Their world would shatter. And this is what people psychologically try to keep in balance. And the fact that then these stupid narratives create these cognitive dissonance moments, that's what makes sure that the individuals will not think more deeply about the implications of their statements. Because if they did, they would recognize that they are at odds with each other, but they don't. So, or if they try to go that way, they would go there. So you try to stay away from thinking more deeply about your own belief system. This is wonderfully pointed out, like masterfully pointed out here. It's just another one. There were several of these contradicting beliefs about Russia. Let's continue with the article. Fears of further Russian expansion into the Baltics ignore the fact that Russian society, while supportive of their country's war effort, broadly wants peace. The loud radical warmonger voices in Russia do not reflect broader elite and public attitudes. There is no support in Russia for endless territorial expansion. Indeed, there are strong grounds to believe the narrative of Russia's unquenchable thirst for imperial glory is partly a Western fantasy imposed from without. Inside Russia, the Ukraine conflict is viewed generally as a defensive war against NATO expansion. By all accounts, Trump's pivot to peace is a rejection of dangerous hardliner delusions and a victory for common sense. Yes, that's exactly what it is. As US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth put it, the new approach is based on the recognition of hard power realities on the ground. Europe's leaders must now adopt sensibly to this new reality. In pitching to continue the war without US backing, Europe's hardliners are selling a costly recipe for risk and insecurity. In Europe, Europe's taxpayers are asked to foot the bill while suffering in austerity and recession. Neither Trump's bold talk nor the hardliner rhetoric should distract Europe from the most important point. A complex deal is needed to secure peace in Ukraine and Europe. What is needed is a major rethink of how Europe can achieve lasting peace in the continent. Europe could and should be worried about the signals from Washington that shatter the fundamentals of our security thinking. It is statesmanship and strategic thinking, rather than knee-jerk emotive rhetoric and moral panic, that is desperately needed. As part of a fundamental shift towards strategic autonomy, Europe will need to reconsider its relations with a range of countries, including Russia. It is time to accept that a lasting peace in Europe without the inclusion of Russia is impossible. While building a defense deterrent is a necessity, it must be recalled that the EU's greatest achievement is its ushering in of 80 years of peace and prosperity on the continent. This should be the desired trajectory. The sooner the war ends, the sooner taxpayer money can be spent on rebuilding and integrating Ukraine into the EU. When it comes to negotiations, Europe's leaders must start talking about the world as it is, not only about how they want it to be. The statements of Trump, Hegseth, and Kellogg may be bitter pills to swallow, yet for Europe, this is a necessary prescription that is long overdue. And I can only congratulate Matthew Blackburn from the bottom of my heart for such a sober and well-structured analysis of the situation, because this fantasy land of which the New York Times is part of, but New York Times is just upstream of all the European press, the European press, even the big ones. They all look at the New York Times and then they just keep copying the mindset and the framework of those people, right? And Washington Post and so on. This tickle-down propaganda system that is in place. And this is now the reality that is kicking in, because war is a terrible, absolutely horrible thing. But one of the things it does is it makes it crystal clear what the realities are, because you cannot ignore them once they come knocking at your door. Hitler couldn't ignore the Russians anymore, or the victory of the Russians during the Second World War, when they were shelling his bunker. And we are now close to such a moment. You cannot sell these stupid narratives of we will win. It just takes a little longer when actually the military loss is there. And that's one of the problems, one of the things that now really crushes the narrative of the West, which they're not used to. The Europeans and the North America is not used to having their entire narrative about themselves crumble this hard. The Vietnam War was a hard crumbling. The aftermath of the Iraq War and all of the revelations about weapons of mass destruction that were never there, that that gnawed a bit, that kind of took something away of the main narrative, but it didn't crush the narrative as horrible as this time it is being crushed. And that's now what really hurts people like this, what's his name, this Peter Baker guy, who are still like cognitively in their own tiny little prison and still trying to assert a reality that is already well and long gone. The last piece that I would like to share with you is something again from a mailing list that was sent to me by Jeff Roberts. Jeff Roberts, if you wonder, let me show this, is the historian who wrote this book on Stalin's library. He looked at all the books that Stalin used to own and wrote a beautiful book about this. Um, He's a great historian. Met him a couple of weeks ago. Him here. He has a beautiful homepage. Jeffrey Roberts, historian, biographer, and political commentator. So another one of these scholars who knows very well what they are talking about, and luckily, he also sends around emails. I recommend getting on his email list, which is very valuable in order to get these kind of pieces of information that are floating everywhere around. What does he alert us to in that email? He alerts us to a Facebook post written by Alexander Titov, a lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast. That's this person here, Alexander Titov. So how this works, right? He Jeff Roberts is on a mailing list, and he clicks on something that somebody sends him, and that is written by other scholars who understand something. So scholars and people who actually are good with analysis, sending each other stuff because we want to stay informed, right? So the information sphere is these days moving surprisingly a lot with emails among us. And Alexander Titov then writes a very good Facebook post about his analysis on why he thinks the current approach of the Ukrainians and Europeans makes no sense, because his main argument is that I only read the yellow parts now, that in purely military terms, a ceasefire would benefit Ukraine far more than Russia, given the state of the two armies. And then he goes into this argument saying, like, look, why are you so scared of peace negotiations and an eventual ceasefire when the ceasefire is actually best for the interest of Ukraine? Not just for ending the destruction, but look at where the armies are. Mr. Titov writes that first, while there are real problems with the UAF, the Ukraine Armed Forces, there's no evidence of immediate collapse. So they're holding their lines, often under very unfavorable circumstances. There are no mass surrenders on either side, and fresh recruits are still coming to the Ukrainian armed forces. And let me interject here, this is also a reality, right? Just because some people believe the Russian narratives more, or not the Russian narrative, sorry, I should rephrase this, because we have this tendency of, when we don't like something or something happening, that we then automatically think of that as all as lies. But I've seen this especially on YouTube also quite a lot in the last 1 or 2 years, that every time the Ukrainian stronghold was taken, it was displayed to us as the Ukrainian army collapsing, and this is the collapse, this is the end, right? And Ukraine is now on the brink of complete collapse. And so far, 3 years in, that has not come true. I mean, the army itself, the entire apparatus, the military apparatus of Ukraine is under very, very heavy strain, obviously, but it is not collapsing the way that it has been predicted from several sides several times. So I think this is a very sober analysis. Yes, the UAF is losing this war, but it's not at the point where everybody just throws away their guns and runs away. That's not what's happening, right? So he tries to go into the into a comparison of the two, and he still comes to the conclusion that the Ukrainian army should be the first one to want a ceasefire, right? Which is probably also what the Russians know, which is why they are not willing to give a ceasefire before they don't have a clear arrangement with the Americans and, well, the Europeans and the Ukrainians. Let's continue reading. Desertion is a serious problem in the Ukrainian army. Desertion mostly occurs during rotations or with new units before they actually go into actions. So he says that this is not something that is at the point where desertions will completely destroy the Ukrainian army. And that's obviously true because they're still standing there. The problem with the UAF is that they are overstretched. They have no reserves, and they often hold on to hopeless positions for political reasons. The UAF has logistical disadvantages compared to Russia, like a lack of reliable supply of key weapon system and Russian dominance in some types of weapons, which is also obvious to the development of this war, because right now the Russians are managing to capture one place after another, right? So these are some of this is some of the background of why that it is happening. The UAF also suffers from manpower shortages, with many of its units operating at 40 to 50% of their supposed strength. In essence, the UAF clearly suffers from some of the same problems as the Russian army did in 2022. Poor leadership, chaotic organization and coordination, chronic understaffing, lack of rotation and reserves. But the Russian army of late 2022 to 2023 went on the defensive, regrouped, rebuilt its strength, and organized defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer of 2023 and begun its own slow but steady offensive from October 2023 that continues to this day. An interjection from my side, let's not forget that the Russians made it very clear that their main goal was never winning a lot of territory. It was to make sure the Ukrainian army would not pose a threat, or NATO material in Ukraine would not pose a threat to Russia anymore. It is a doctrine of degrading the enemy forces, right? As some of my guests have also pointed out. And I think this timeline here is pretty much what we're seeing. So now the Russians are on a slow but steady and still grinding down of the Ukrainian march forward. Now it is partially about territory, but for the longest time, the Russian strategy was not that. So we continue in the article. The Russian army of 2025 is better led, organized, armed, and supplied than it was in 2022 to 2023. The Ukrainian forces, on the contrast, have deteriorated. They have lost their early advantage of numerical superiority, which they had thanks to early mobilization and large numbers of volunteers in 2022, most of whom had combat experience from their service in the ATO against the Donbass separatists in 2014 to 2022. So my impression, says the author of the text, is that the Russian command is preparing for a decisive campaign in the spring-summer of 2025. So this is trajectory. We don't know whether that's true or not, but okay, this is a reasonable thing to expect from seeing how the war has been developing and has been fought by these two armies, right? That's why then the author, Mr. Now I forgot his name, Mr. Titov, comes to his final conclusion, the logical conclusion. That's why I don't understand Ukrainian supporters who are so horrified by the prospect of Trump-initiated peace talks. It's obviously not going to be a pretty peace for Ukraine, but it's not as if Trump is going to snatch a victory from Zelensky. It's clear that the longer the war goes on, the more losses Ukraine will suffer, with potentially catastrophic consequences. Why am I reading that to you? I'm reading it to you to show you how people build a rational argument based upon sober analysis about the correlation of forces and the realities that we are seeing on the ground. This is exactly why the fantasy, lunatic fantasy world of people like Mr. Baker are ultimately self-defeating, because these narratives will run into the problem that reality works in a different way. So um, it's it's absolutely tragic though, because this fantasy world of the Bakers and Co. That's what has given us this war. That's what has given us this utter wrong image of Russia and this idea that Russia is easy to defeat because it's really just a gas station masquerading as a country. So a lot of it is actually a lack of knowledge and being really really dumb about your assessment of the significant other side of the enemy, right? If you want to frame it as such. So ultimately, stupidity will bite you in the arse. Um, I am thankful and grateful to people like Alexander Titov, like Jeffrey Roberts, Matthew Blackburn, sensible, intelligent people who try to give us insight into the development not only of what's happening on the day and the daily business on the ground, but who then try to create rational arguments and analysis about it. This is exactly what we need, and I wonder how long it will take until we get that again in mainstream media. I wonder if we ever had it. I would have to go back and look it up, but the fact that it is not there in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of the tickle downstream European media, that's what gives us this war delusion that I think almost drove us to the point of nuclear exchange with Russia. Let's see how long it goes until we get team sanity back in the driving seat, also in the mainstream. Thank you very much.